Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan, and I'm absolutely delighted to have Dr. Frances Chapman, law professor now, Lakehead University in Canada. And Frances, thank you so much for agreeing to let me interview you. But before we have you say anything, I just want to tell our audience that I discovered you in my literature review for my doctoral research under code words Undue Influence, and your name kept coming up over and over about violence, domestic abuse survivors, about forced police confessions. There was even one journal article about how cases like Patty Hearst might be revisited in light of what we now understand about psychology of the human mind and how undue influence works and such. And I even invited you to come and present at my forensic think tank, the Program in Psychiatry and the Law. And you did a really wonderful presentation on how police were using the Reed technique, which is a terrible technique to force false confessions from people, and especially egregious technique working with indigenous people who have different cultural norms in terms of nonverbals and verbal feedbacks, etc. So Frances, having said that, I want to congratulate you for your promotion to full professorship
Thank you.
at the School of Law. I'm so excited, and I'm going to ask you, in light of what's happening in America, around the world, with the insurrection effort, attempts to take over the United States. Help. What are your thoughts? First tell us a little bit about how you got interested in undue influence, and then let's get into what can we do? What does the law need to understand from your point of
Yeah,
view?
thank you so much, Steve. That's a great introduction. Thanks for having me today to talk about this important topic. I've been a professor for the last 15 years, and one student at a time, I've tried to get across to them how important it is that we think about undue influence and how many different areas it really impacts. I started this research about 15 years ago when I started my PhD dissertation, and I kind of realized that this research has been going on for decades and decades, but it hasn't got the light on it that I think this is such an important time in the history of undue influence and coercive control, because governments are actually recognizing this for the first time. And I'm proud to say in Canada, we have a private members bill right now that's about to hopefully be passed that actually recognizes a crime of coercive control. And my particular area has been largely around battered women. So it's a real step forward. Our Divorce Act now, when looking at the best interests of the child, looks at coercive and controlling behavior of the parents, which is a huge step forward. That just came in March 1st of this year.
Wow.
So this is that turning point that I was looking for 15 years ago when, not many people were willing to go out there and talk about this. For my dissertation, I decided to use the term brainwashing, which is so laden with all of that,
Yep.
ancient and movie Manchurian Candidate kind of thoughts behind it. I kind of wanted to take back that term, but I've really seen people like Alan Shefflin using coercive persuasion, Evan Stark using coercive control. That seems to be the term that's actually got some traction in Canada, in the US, and beyond. So I think finally we're having those discussions. I had originally come to this area of research because I'm a terrible sleepwalker. So in law school, I'd done a lot of work on automatism and looking at those unconscious abilities that we have to do things that we have no control under. When I got to my LLM dissertation in duress, I looked at more of the situation where somebody's got a gun to their head and kind of started thinking about the Patty Hearst kind of situation, but thought she didn't have a gun to her head 24/7 when she was under the control of the SLA. And I started to think, well, what about those other victims? What about those other people that wouldn't have a defense? And we saw what happened to Patty Hearst, being sentenced to 7 years in prison, even though it commuted later on. She received more time than some of the people from the SLA that were prosecuted who were actually holding her captive. I said, something just doesn't sit right with this of women who could be under that kind of control. And of course, in Canada, the big example that we have is with Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. It's a big case in Canada. Didn't get the same kind of traction necessarily in the US, but was one of those cases where she was under the control of this sexual sadist. And that's what I ended up writing my dissertation about, was these sexual sadists who, groom these women. Karla was only 17 years old when she first met him, groomed her to be somebody who would collaborate in these crimes that he was doing, had no criminal past herself, has had no criminal history since she's been released from prison, but came under the control of this really very charismatic individual. I thought, what defense would Karla Homolka have? And that's pretty much like writing the F word across, my school, trying to suggest that Karla would have a defense. But I'm like, what about those women? What about those women who need the law to recognize that their actions may not have been themselves, that we should look at the actor and not necessarily the act, and ask whether they are morally blameworthy? And that's what all of my research has really gravitated around, those kind of individuals. And could they have a defense? Could we have something that would help them? And of course, the flip side of that, should we have an offense of coercive control, which is the way we're headed in Canada right now?
Yeah, it's so exciting for me, and I'm kicking myself because in my dissertation title, I try to stick in every major term. So I use brainwashing, thought reform, mind control, trafficking, undue influence, and I didn't add coercive control. So, oh well. But the critical thing is for me, and I've been at this now 45 years because of my own experience, direct experience, because of the Moonies, but just the need to understand due influence from undue influence. This is my continuum chart that you know so well.
Yes.
And helping the law have a way systematically to evaluate any particular case, which is why I feel the Shefflin social influence model is so valuable, because it looks at the influencee and the influencer and the mode of opportunity, context, and techniques of influence, which helps to create a frame. But so tell us, if you had a wish list, you're the professor, you have students, let's say there are lawyers around the world listening to you, make the case for why they need to learn more about this and why laws need to be updated, please.
Yes, and I look very much from that micro level of one individual, unduly influencing another individual. So that's more where you're, Steve, you're looking at cults and that, more macro level of how that control can look. But I think as lawyers, we all need to be trained in this. And the article that I'm writing right now says, I think every lawyer in Canada, every lawyer in North America should be trained on coercive control to recognize it in their clients that come into their office. I just took a course on mediation and arbitration, and mediators and arbitrators in Canada are required to take a 21-hour course. So I thought, oh, what fun, I'm on sabbatical. I'll take a 21-hour course on screening for domestic violence. And I think it's invaluable. I think we should put that right into the curriculum for law schools. And I'm going to push to do that in my courses for sure, to have students from the very, baby law school students that they are, know what coercive control is, look for the signs in their clients, so that even though we're not psychologists, we're not counselors, we're not social workers, but to be able to recognize it, to give those resources to our clients, I think every single lawyer needs to know that, needs to be able to recognize it, even if it's not their area. But definitely criminal law lawyers, family law lawyers should be doing this on a regular basis to say, okay, this is a person who needs a safety plan. This is a person who needs to know how they can escape an abusive relationship. And this is what we can do to give them those resources. Even though we are not the ones that are going to offer that, we should be that conduit. So this is my pitch for knowing about coercive control, is every single one of us is going to encounter a client who has those kinds of influences that are going on, particularly for me within the context of domestic violence. But so many of our clients, I've even, Steve, you'll like this, I've written a contracts article on undue influence in contract law. Like, you can't think of anything more boring than contract law. Sorry to all my contract law fellows out there, but looking at undue influence, and there's some astounding cases in that article that I wrote about the kind of influence you can see even in a contractual perspective, that, you know, pretty much a gun held to the head of somebody else unless they sign over title, unless they do this. Steve, you and I have talked about looking at conservatorships, looking at individuals who are in a situation where they are not in a position to control their own finances. So, you know, I'm saying every lawyer should have this exposure. You know, family lawyers, criminal lawyers, those are the ones we think of first, but there's so many different areas. Everyone should be trained in this.
Yes, and I would add judges especially need to understand this. Of course, I'm a mental health professional, so my area of expertise is more the healing part for people coming out of these relationships, or coaching families and friends how to help a loved one who are currently involved. But there's so many cases where the person can pass a simple test of competency. They know the day of the week, they know their name, and they know who the president is. But if you but no questions are asked really about the forces in their life that made them cut off contact with their family and friends, drop out of school, donate their bank account, etc. For our listeners, could you just tell us more about coercive control, the law that you think is going to be gaining traction and maybe even voted in as legislation?
Yeah, and this is the really interesting part, that, you know, the law system as it's set up now is really designed to do episodic individual situations. So there's a domestic battering situation, the police come, they can charge, you can see those physical injuries, take those pictures. Okay, we have an incident. That's how we look at domestic violence right now. The legislation that's going through says, okay, physical violence is only one aspect of that. What about emotional abuse? What about the psychological abuse? What about these tiny little microaggressions that happen over a period of 10 years, 15 years, even a year or two? Those little tiny microaggressions may look like nothing from the outside, but, you know, I've read so much of different individuals saying, well, I had a woman come and talk to me and say that, you know, we were at a baseball game and it was really cold out, so her partner had come over to give her a sweater, and everybody there was like, oh, isn't that sweet, that's happened. But to her, she knows that means you should be covered up and you're not doing this, and there's going to be a bill to pay when we get home, that she knows that's an aggression of something that's going to lead to a violent situation. Those are the kinds of things we want to look at, not those episodic, a beating of an individual. The law is set up okay to deal with that. It doesn't cover everything, absolutely not, but these psychological matters, the abuse of animals and pets, something that I'm very passionate about as well. That's something that's coming into the legislation to see if there's been violence against them. Any, you know, destruction of property. So our expanded notion of what domestic violence is has been expanded with coercive control to say it's those little elements, it's those things that build up over time, it's those comments that are made that the woman, and I speak in terms of women and men because the majority of violence is perpetrated against women, but there's absolutely other situations. But for this particular
the men
example,
being controlled by women, I have a couple of cases like that right now by a psychopathic wife or girlfriend.
Absolutely. And there's those cases. And as we've talked about, Steve, I've been doing some work on parental alienation over my sabbatical as well, which can be by either parent is trying to alienate a child from the other parent. And I should send this to you, Steve. One case that I was looking at out of the UK, a woman was a part of a cult out of Australia and was coaching the child that she needed to hit. There's all kinds of dietary restrictions with this particular cult then too, that she couldn't eat gluten, and was trying to say that her father was going to go to hell because he wasn't part of this cult that they were part of as well. So absolutely, it can happen both ways. But the scary thing for me is looking at these cases of parental alienation, and so many mental health experts have been talking about this forever, and we have been talking about it a lot less in the legal field. So I want to do a lot more research on that area. But what I'm seeing at some cases coming out of Ontario where I am are judges just on their own, without even any evidence being presented of parental alienation, saying, yep, that's a situation of parental alienation, and I'm going to make a decision based on that, based on no experts, no evidence that's there, that I think absolutely parental alienation exists, and this is something we need to look at. But we can't simply have judges going rogue and saying, yep, this is it, when they have absolutely no training. That same training for lawyers should be the training that judges have as well, to understand coercive control, and not simply make it up out of thin air when they think it might fit a situation.
Right, exactly. To have a set of criteria. And of course, for me, I just want to say, getting out of the Moonies in 1976, I've encountered mostly for the first few decades where cults, somebody, parent, decided they can't stand being in the cult anymore, wanted to leave. The other parent was in the cult with the kids, and the cult programs the family to think they're going to hell, they're filled with Satan or whatever. It tells them they can't have any contact with the parent, even makes up stories of abuse to try to coerce and manipulate the legal system for full custody. So that's a group process. It isn't just a single person. And with what is happening now in the United States following the failed insurrection attempt of January 6th, I'm hearing a lot of legislators saying, yeah, we got to punish those people who broke into our Capitol, but there's no discussion on what incited them, who incited them, what was the role of Trump, his authority as president, of the media, of other politicians that were saying the election was stolen. So there's this bigger frame. I don't know if we'll see something in the United States where these will be addressed, but if we're interested in justice, I don't think anybody came up with the idea on their own. I think I'm going to go to the Capitol and break the windows and try to hang Mike Pence or something like that. So, I guess I want to start by asking you, please, if you had your way right now and you had someone from the Biden administration listening to you, what would you say about how you look at what's happening with information and with power in the United States and the world?
Yeah, and things have changed so much even in the last decade when it comes to social media, that you see how that control of Trump to incite those riots just absolutely spread like wildfire using social media means. And again, that goes back to this kind of macro level that I'm getting into more of, that power and coercion really means something. We've had decades and decades and decades of research on this, of how coercive control can work, how people can be influenced in that way. And I think that's just the perfect example at the Capitol of people being incited to do something, having this person who's at the top of that pyramid, whether it's a charismatic leader of a cult, and Steve, you've seen so many of those, or having, I know your last book, Steve, was called The Cult of Trump, having this charismatic leader at the top of that pyramid telling people to do something. As soon as I saw it unfolding on TV, and so many of us in Canada were glued to the television watching that with you, Steve, that this is this is somebody who invited them to do this. This is somebody who was exerting that kind of control over the past 4, 6, 7, 8 years, particularly using social media. And again, I've looked at some of the more micro level of what social media, what control that could have. I wrote a piece on Slender Man. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, Steve, or not. This Slender Man character, this happened about 6 years ago. 2 12-year-old girls were going on something called a wiki called Creepypasta. So they'd go onto this site and people would add writings to this story about this character named Slender Man. So there's weird pictures of him all over the internet. He's this charismatic leader that they think is out there, and they want that Slender Man wants them to do things. So these 2 12-year-old girls decided that Slender Man was actually real. He was out there. He lived in this forest in Wisconsin where they were from, and that to make Slender Man happy, they had to go kill their 12-year-old friend. So they actually stabbed her something like, 29 times.
Oh, terrible.
Trying to make this fictional character, but it was so real in their minds. And they've both since been committed to psychiatric institutions. They have actually got a court date actually next week. This has been going on for some time, but you saw that kind of, and that's somebody who's not real. When you look at a Trump, someone who's very real, has very real powers, this is just astronomically exploded to this huge level, not just this micro of these girls being misguided and doing these things. We see the power that this can have, and especially for Generation Z that's coming up right now, the power that social media has, the power that they have to connect with those individuals, the way that these algorithms work to give them more material based on what they've had before, that they think the entire world is based on these same thoughts. So, not only is this very real, it's very dangerous, and the Capitol riots are just the perfect example.
Yeah, and I would just add my thesis when I researched the cult of Trump was that there are actual authoritarian cults whose leaders are telling their followers to do what Trump had said. It wasn't just Trump directly to everybody, but there were all these other actors, whether it's Opus Dei, the Family, New Apostolic Reformation, neo-Nazi groups, just to name a few, that were all bringing their bases to, and I would add media, not just social media, but Breitbart, Alex Jones, Fox News, and so many other media outlets, talk radio, Christian broadcasting. There were so many prophets and apostles of God that were prophesying God wanted Trump. And so people were not liking Trump, but they were wanting to do what God wanted, according to whoever their leader was. But, for me, Frances, my framework of the BITE model of behavior control, information, thought, and emotional control, it really fits on the individual level or a government. Like if a government is censoring all critical information and dissonance, killing them, jailing them, throwing them out of the country, you can use the same parameters to say this is not democracy, this is not human rights, this is authoritarianism, plain and simple. However, we all need to wake up and get past the myth of invulnerability that it can't happen to me. It's only weak, stupid people who can be lied to and manipulated. But the human mind is pretty fragile and adaptive. And we do have hard wiring to believing authority figures we think are legitimate, or hardwired to conforming to our peer group if we identify with them. And so many other things that have now been scientifically demonstrated in social psychology.
And I think it's really important for people to know that this could happen to anyone. Exactly what you just said, Steve. I have students who say, would never happen to me. I'm smart. Nobody would ever be able to influence me in that way. And I go back to, Lewis West had done an article years and years ago in the 1950s about military training, that they were getting very concerned out of Korea, out of China, that there was mind control methods being used. I thought, oh, great. Well, for our Navy officers, we're going to actually train them in psychological control and coercion and what might happen to them. And they had this exercise where they told all these military members, you're going to be let off in the desert. People are going to pick you up, a language that you don't know. They're going to take you into their custody and they're going to try to interrogate you. So they said, okay, here's some fake government secrets. We'll give you all some fake ones. Don't give those up. You know them. You don't give them to the other people. And I thought, okay, this is going to take days and weeks and whatever to beat these secrets out of these individuals. And even though all of these military personnel absolutely knew that this was just a training mission, knew that these were fake secrets, about 15% of them, after an extremely short period of time, were not only giving the fake military secrets, but they were giving real military secrets as well. And this is a situation where they knew the threats against their family or whatever was happening was an absolute act. So if we have people who are highly trained military officers, and this is an example from the 50s, but I think it's so eye-opening, anybody can be coercively controlled. Anyone can have that point where they break down. And you see so much in the research that they say an old-fashioned statement, but every man has his breaking point. And I think every woman has their breaking point. It's finding what that is, using that against the individual. And the thought that anybody's immune from that is just crazy. Everybody could be subject to that kind of control.
Yeah, and I want to be clear in my research with interrogation and such that the most effective interrogators didn't physically coerce their victims. They charmed them. They brought them food. They talked about commonalities. They created an alliance. And so I know when I was in the Moonies, my family said, you're brainwashed. Thinking Moon was the Messiah and that democracy was satanic. And I had in my mind this movie of being coerced. I would be in a basement, bright lights and chained up and everything. And I knew that hadn't happened to me. So therefore I dismissed the idea that I had been brainwashed. And it was only when I was exposed in my deprogramming in 1976 to Chinese communist criteria of Robert Lifton, the 8 criteria, I went, we do all of those. The commies are Satan. They do all of those. How is that possible that God and Satan are doing the same thing? And it led to my starting to think for myself. Lewis West, by the way, wrote the review of my first book, Combating Cult Mind Control, in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and I was very grateful to him for that. But what bugs me a lot, if I can just name it, is that the American government, the intelligence services, no one has said to the public, this stuff works. This is real, people. This is how we recruit agents from foreign governments. It's the same process that is used by cults to recruit people in the United States and in Canada. Nobody's saying that, and that's why I've been blasting. It's real, it happened. I know it happened to me. I recruited and indoctrinated other people. Mm-hmm. I also want to just mention, if I may, multi-level marketing groups. Yes. I was part of a 2-day international conference with people from Scotland and from 49 countries, all concerned about millions of people being defrauded into the dream that they're going to make millions of dollars part-time by being part of these commercial cultic groups. And essentially in the 2-day conference, people were saying, isn't there a way we can come up with some type of legislation to make it illegal to defraud people the way that multi-level marketing groups, but they have these powerful lobbying agencies like the Direct Selling Association in Washington, D.C., and they give a lot of money to politicians for their campaigns. So the corruption of authoritarian cults and criminals is another big problem that we're facing, unfortunately.
And isn't that interesting, Steve, that if every man does have his breaking point, then maybe it's not through domestic violence, maybe it's not through a cult, but if it's through multi-level marketing, where money is the key at the end of the day, it just shows that, the spread of coercive control and how many different aspects of your life it actually can control, and how many, end goals there are to these different organizations. I think that anybody can be subject to this. If it's not a cult, then maybe it's multi-level marketing.
Right. Well, so I think of them as commercial cults. I also think of pimps and traffickers as cult leaders,
Yes.
and horrible abuse. I might add that labor trafficking organizations in the U.S. government are now learning about the BITE model and using it to enhance the fraud, force, coercion criteria of trafficking. It's the coercion that it fleshes it out to more micro behaviors like controlling the environment, food, sleep, clothing, changing their name, isolating them in terms of media and other people. So the list, can be explored more robustly.
Yeah, and involuntary servitude. I did an article on the US and how much involuntary servitude is happening in different court cases in the US. I was absolutely shocked, and to see how much control was exerted. There are different cases that I put in that article of different individuals who had found themselves in that situation, and they didn't leave when they had the opportunity to. I find so much of this research comes back to, well, why didn't they just leave? And I did a lot of work on the girl in the box case from California from the 1970s in the US. And she spent most of 7 years in a box under the sexual sadist bed, him and his wife. And she got to the point she'd come out and babysit the children. She'd go grocery shopping. She'd go for a jog, come back and go back into her box, which I think is the absolute perfect metaphor for all of these cults, all of these different influence models, that you don't need to have a gun to your head. There is, and I called my dissertation Intangible Captivity. There's no bars that we can see, but that doesn't mean those bars aren't there, trapping somebody within their mind of what they think they can do and they can't. And there's no other explanation why people who are involved in involuntary servitude, who have had all their possessions taken and having to do forced labor, see other people go into town and do not say a word about what's going on with them.
Yeah, exactly. I'm reminded of Elizabeth Smart, who
Yes.
was kidnapped from her bedroom by knife point and raped and abused. And when the police, interrogated her, asked her questions, she kept denying she was Elizabeth Smart. And the policeman went to the police department, got the photo, the photo of her and held it by her face. She said, "That's you." And she's like, "Nope, that's not me." But it was her, because
Yeah.
she had been programmed that the old her was dead, and she was reborn as the second wife to the prophet. But fortunately she was helped and got out, and has been a big advocate for survivors of abduction. And mind control is real.
Yeah, and Colleen Stan, who was kept in this box for the period of time, the wife of the sexual sadist man who had her trapped, finally said, none of these things you think are true. They had created this thing called the company, that you are being watched by the company. So if you try to escape, the company will get you. Bad things will happen to you. So the wife, Janice Hooker, finally said, there is no company. There's nothing keeping you here. You can leave. Colleen Stan, after 7 years in a box, went home like nothing had happened and tried to take up in her life where she left off 7 years ago. She never went to the police. She never said what had happened to her. It was only when Janice Hooker went to the police and said, "Guess what my husband's doing," after she had conveniently got rid of all the evidence that would have implicated her in her part in that. She got rid of all that evidence, then went to the police. But it was never Colleen Stan who went to the police. The police had to track her down and say, "Hey, is there anything you want to tell us about the last 7 years?"
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's these types of cases that give us windows into basically impermissible social psychology experiments. But it's
Yeah.
by post interviewing and understanding the steps of breaking somebody down, indoctrinating them, creating a new identity. And even in the mental health field, while there is a category that's named in the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic Statistical Manual, that's a big mouthful, number 5, it talks about dissociative disorder 300.15 as an identity disturbance, and it names cults and brainwashing. There's no specific criteria that mental health professionals can actually diagnose and treat. And there's no treat, as you say, lawyers need to be trained. I say mental health professionals need to be trained.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We just think lawyers know about this or lawyers would understand this. And it was really brought to home to me with automatism, which is, the sleepwalking defense that I've done some research on as well. That one of the cases I was looking at, they actually had a retrial because the lawyer said, "Oh, I didn't know automatism existed. I didn't know that was a defense." Like, how can you not know? No student is going through my classroom without knowing that's a defense. Exactly the same thing for coercive control. Every single student that we see should at least be introduced to what that is, and not necessarily, we start with the social psychological, the DSM, we talk about that, but there doesn't necessarily have to be something wrong with you. And I think that's what a lot of people think. Well, there's something wrong with that person that would go under the bed for 7 years. There's something wrong with that military person who'd give away secrets. But I think it's important for all lawyers to understand it could happen to anyone. What that currency is, what that could be held over you, maybe that's different for every individual, but it's so real, as you say, Steve. It's real, it's out there, and it's part of so many more of the cases than we want to recognize. And we know when we get to court, judges say, "Okay, great, battle of the experts. That's what the psychologist says, that's what the psychiatrist says, but it's a legal problem that we need to solve ourselves from a legal perspective." Fine, we can take the information that we can take from mental health professionals and say, "This is what's going on," but say, "These are the legal ramifications to it. This is why your client should have a not criminally responsible defense in that case. This is why they should have duress. This is why they should have coercive persuasion." And if lawyers have no idea that exists, that that's a route they could go down, then they're obviously not going to go down that road. We need to get lawyers to the point that they're courageous in this, that they recognize that this is real, and that we're making those arguments to the court.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to also do a shout out for the state of California that instituted undue influence laws for especially the elderly, focused on the elderly, but they've actually developed a whole training format as well as an evaluation for the folks that are charged with evaluating elderly people. And I included that in my doctoral dissertation because it's the same formula for elderly that could be applied in any other case. And so I'm obviously advocating for expanding undue influence instead of just looking at elderly people and very young people, but everybody in between. And I also wanted to just come back to a broader point, if I may, Frances, it's called the fundamental attribution error in social psychology. And it's that unconscious bias we all have that when we're trying to understand other human beings' behaviors, we have a tendency to over-attribute personality or dispositional variables and underestimate the social context or situational variables. And what we now understand about our 5 senses and our mind and our brain is that we're completely taking in information all the time and adapting unconsciously to our environments. And while one might say Stephen was stupid for getting in the Moonies or weak or dumb or looking for a father figure, Steve's subjective experience was Steve was doing just fine. His girlfriend dumped him. Women were flirting and lying to him. And if he had any idea it was a religious cult, he would have ran in the other direction. But it was this lack of informed consent. I wanted to mention also, Frances, there's a new group, and I'm not remembering exactly their name, but they're trying to get legislation for consent awareness to up the criteria for informed consent. And because what's happening is people are entering into these NDAs and contracts saying that they're going to give over any concerns to binding arbitration or non-disclosures, and then they're sued. But they were deceptively recruited. They didn't know what they were getting involved with in the first place. And talk to me about that it contracts, the beginning thing, and what we can possibly do to protect consumers, for lack of a better way to say it.
And I think that's fascinating as well, that so many people who enter into contracts don't know exactly what they're entering into. There's a great documentary called Hot Coffee about the McDonald's case where, you know, a woman had spilled hot coffee on. In addition to criminal law, I teach tort law. So I go into that kind of case and look at it. And in that documentary, they actually have another case with an American woman who was a contractor in Iraq. And while she was there, she was taken into one of their barracks where these people were staying and was brutally raped. But when she looked at her employment contract, it said, we will resolve any problem that you might have with this contractor through arbitration. So she had to go through this, and the arbitrators were picked by the company that, you know, was the one that she was working for. She had no control over it. She was saying, no, I want my day in court. I want to be able to say I was raped in open court and have those people be responsible for what happened to me. But when they kept going back to her employment contract, everything was closed off for the way she could do. And she was unsuccessful. She had actually got Al Franken to help her to help her with that situation. But she wasn't successful in getting her day in court. So we can see even in something as horrible, and we think a criminal matter, we're going back to contracts and saying, okay, well, the company was smart enough to make sure that you wouldn't have those opportunities open to you. So contract law is absolutely part of this entire equation, and some crazy things that people have agreed to in contracts. It's only as good as the paper that it's written on, but who has the resources to be able to go and dispute this in court, to go and say this contract shouldn't be binding, that there was undue influence? And the bar is very high to say that there was undue influence, you know, unless you're pretty much looking at a situation with a gun to your head. The courts in Britain and Canada particularly were not very receptive to understand that this exists. That has to change as well.
Yeah, 100%. It's my life work, and I'm so grateful to you as a law professor, who you have all these students coming through your classrooms, and you're going to be seeding them with this really injustice.
And one student at a time, you know, it's not the huge social movement necessarily that you think, but I've taught 8 years at this law school. So I have 8 graduated classes who contact me and say, hey, look, from something I saw in your class, I'm like, this additional criminal defense should apply. And thanks to you, I actually know that exists, even though it's, you know, doesn't happen all the time. Thank you for making sure that I knew about undue influence. So at least I asked the questions. At least I talked to my client to determine if this was a situation where this would apply.
Yeah, exactly. I want to bring up a case to you that I wrote a blog about. It was divorce attorney Michael Fine, who was basically telling his female clients who are undergoing a divorce, you know, you're very tense. I can help you relax. And he was using covert hypnosis and then sexually abusing them and then giving them amnesia so they wouldn't even remember what happened to them. And my understanding is he got busted because one of his clients, who was very courageous, came back from one of her meetings with him, and her panties were on backwards and there was a wet stain. She went to the police immediately. There was no semen on the wetness, and they said, tell us what happened. She said, I don't know. I saw my lawyer and I know I put my panties on the right way. And then there was no moisture over on the side. And they said, we can't help you. And she went back and recorded her next molestation. And then they did a sting. And then they found out he was making his own recordings, kind of trophies of all these molestations. But unfortunately, it never went to trial. They did a plea deal of 12 years, which was way too little. I believe the charges were kidnapping.
Oh, wow.
You know, it had nothing to do with undue influence that I could see in terms of the public media. Tell me what your reaction is to this.
Well, this is the problem in so many of these cases. As lawyers, we're trained, what's the evidence? Where's the evidence? What can we gather? What can we do? And in episodic events like a brutal sexual assault, okay, we can get those semen samples. We can have that evidence of what had happened. We're good at dealing with that, dealing with the situation that's outside the norm and being able to gather that. How does a battered woman tell you about the 300 episodes where, she had been put down by her husband in front of her children? Like, how are you supposed to record what happened there? And so many of the times the things that are happening aren't themselves criminal. So in a battering situation, a husband not allowing his wife to have friends and go out with them. Well, how do you prove that, well, my husband didn't allow me to go out? As individual pieces, it doesn't amount to much. As this woman whose underwear were on backwards, is that a criminal act? No. Can she prove what had happened? That's very difficult. So how much does a woman or whoever this may be have to go through for the police to actually understand and believe what happened? But we come from this tradition of, we need evidence, we need to be able to go into a courtroom and say what had happened. There's some big cases in Canada as well with sexual assault that, the victims had continued to have a relationship with their abuser after that alleged incident. And, the Canadian public went crazy, like, well, she saw him again, she left him a note that said, had a great time. She did these things. We have this evidence that shows that this was not a sexually abusive situation, but it was. And it was these women saying, I didn't understand the power he had over me. I left that note because I thought I should do that in the situation. So not only do we have a lack of evidence to prove the coercion happened, but we have a present evidence that says that it was an ongoing relationship. And people just absolutely could not understand how she would still have contact, how 2 years later she texted him about something. They use that to say, okay, no sexual abuse, no coercion, we're all done here, we're going to acquit that person.
Yeah, black and white, all or nothing, and it's really horrible. I had another question I wanted to ask you, and it went in one brain and out the other.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah. So I would like you to, we're going to wrap up shortly, but you did such a brilliant presentation for the forensic think tank on the Reid technique and police forced confessions that the people, then we found out they didn't do it, but they actually, some of them believed that they did it. Yeah. And this is a contained context where we know the police were using undue influence. Share a little bit with our listeners.
Yeah, and I had got into false confessions in the last few years of being a broader extension of that box of the individual to this being institutionalized, and really took a deep dive into the Reid technique, which is still used in the US and Canada today. It's not used in Europe. Other countries have absolutely said that's not a police technique that we want anymore. But within that technique, I read all the manuals that police are still being trained in, and just found all this racist, sexist language throughout that technique, saying the person you're interrogation is of lower moral character, and things like a guilty person will do this, an innocent person will do that. A guilty person will not make eye contact, an innocent person will make eye contact. So I took that to the next level and was retained as an expert in a particular hearing where there was an Indigenous subject who was interrogated by the police. And the amount of times that they said, look at me, why aren't you looking at me? Why aren't you making eye contact? But from a cultural level, that was something this individual was completely uncomfortable doing. That wasn't part of their cultural milieu that they were coming from. And to see that and to see how they were pressured into that confession and how they felt that they should say yes to the questions that were being asked of them. Again, culturally, I started to do a dive into linguistics, and gratuitous confirmation is a linguistic tool that different researchers have looked at, that in certain cultures, people are much more willing to say yes to any question from somebody in authority. So as I mentioned to Pipedal, you go through these transcripts and this person is saying yes, 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 yes to all these questions that are answered, but they don't truly mean that they're agreeing with those statements. It's a sign of respect for them to say yes to that person in authority. And this just has devastating impacts for all kinds of cultural groups. Indigenous peoples is one of the mandates of my law school to bring justice. And, there's just been a horrible finding in the last couple days at a residential school in the west coast of
I
Canada.
read about that. Horrible.
Yes, when they found 215 buried children, that were the victims of the residential school experience. So it's been our mandate that we need to get out the word that, justice is not equal for all, and that we have to be changing it lawyer by lawyer, having Indigenous courses, knowing about Indigenous law, knowing about Indigenous culture, so that these lawyers can go out and be understanding to our First Nations peoples in Canada. So that has always been very important to us, and renewed calls within the last few days about those issues. And for me, looking at the interrogations of Indigenous people, I think that's important to know that if the police are putting everyone into one box, and we can read body language, which the psychological research on that shows that you're no more able to dictate body language and know what it means than somebody who's randomly trying to ascribe those characteristics to individuals, that we need to stop relying on those crutches that are from a Western perspective, a white male perspective, and saying that everybody should fit into that box and you are guilty if you do not fit into that box, which just leads to all kinds of injustices in our society.
Yeah, but in that police interrogation thing, they had all the authority. They would keep the person for hours and hours and hours. I mean, you could go through a lot of the behavioral criteria as well. And rather than a presumption of innocence, it was a presumption of guilt.
Yes.
And then what I found particularly fascinating is that there would be a percentage of these folks who would confess that weren't just complying to get out of the coercion, but they actually started believing that they had committed the crime. Could you just say a comment about that?
Yeah, I had a few cases that I presented at Pipedal as well, one being a sheriff from the United States and somebody who was intimately aware of the American justice system and what had happened. But his two teenage daughters had come forward and said that he was part of a sadistic ring of child abusers, and that he had killed hundreds of babies in their backyard and sexually abused them. These just wild accusations. And after he was interrogated, I think it was more than 30 interrogations by the time he actually confessed to this, but they had his pastor come in, different interrogators saying, different social psychological experts saying, well, your memory is going to come back to you. Maybe it just hasn't come. And after the end of these interrogations, he confessed that he was part of the satanic rituals that were going on in his backyard. Zero evidence was ever found, zero bodies of these 500 babies that his daughters were alleging. There was absolutely no marks on either of his daughters, no evidence. And again, evidence doesn't mean everything, but there was just an absolute lack of any evidence. But this person who was so intimately engaged in the legal system, knew how it worked, still was talked into actually adopting these beliefs and saying, yes, I must have done it. And there's this whole line of cases where they use that kind of language. Well, I guess I must have, I guess I did, I guess, yeah, maybe I was drunk and I don't remember, maybe I did do it. So many cases where that kind of language is used used, and that person, they call it coerced internalized confessions, that they actually internalize it into themselves and actually start to believe, yeah, maybe I should conflate some memories of what had happened in that situation because I must have done it. And lots of people later on then at their trial, Billy Wayne Cope was an example that I used at the Pipedal talk as well. That's an individual that had actually gone and recreated how he'd sexually assaulted and killed his 12-year-old daughter. He actually went on video and tried to recreate that. It was completely unlike what they determined what had happened to his daughter. Another serial rapist actually confessed to doing that. And they said, well, Billy Wayne Cope must have been a co-conspirator then as well. And he went to jail, tried to get his freedom, tried to get that confession thrown out. But he was somebody who said, the police know what they're doing. They're going to find out. I'll just tell them this for right now. And, I will recreate how I did this and conflate these memories. But later on, he's like, I absolutely didn't do this. Juries convict about 80% of the time, even when they know that that coercion was that confession was coerced out of that individual. So once there's that confession, it's pretty much a death sentence for so many of these people who wrongly confess.
It's so horrible. I'm so grateful to you for your passion, for your interest, for your intelligence, but your commitment to helping to raise the bar of people's understanding of how the mind works and undue influence and coercive control. I'm so excited to hear that maybe Canada might pass some legislation. I actually have a few clients in Canada who might benefit from this law, in fact. So we'll be in touch regarding
I will keep you posted.
some of those cases. In wrapping up, is there any last thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Oh, thank you, Steve. Thank you for having this blog. Thank you for having this place where, you've curated all of these experts in these different areas. And, it really is what was needed in this area. I think we were all working kind of in silos, convinced, of our own perspectives that we have, but bringing so many people together, not just in the mental health professions, but in law, in other areas. I think we need to work together. I think that's the key. And thinking I'm a lawyer, I don't need to know about these mental health issues. That's not something that's going to fly anymore. And I think this next generation, millennials, are very much embracing mental health issues. So I think they're so much more receptive to understanding that coercive control is very real and we need to address it now.
Yes, and I look forward to many more conversations and meeting you in person. And let's develop a training program for lawyers and judges and mental health people while we're at it.
Let's do it.
Yay. Thank you again so much.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay, take care.